To settle a wealthy man's gambling debts, Rosalie was sold to the terrifying legend known as the Beast of Widow's Peak. Expecting a savage end in the unforgiving snow, she instead found herself confronted by a towering giant who emerged from the shadows, his burning gaze tracing her form before he claimed her with a soft, possessive, "Mine." The year was 1875, and the unforgiving wind of the Colorado Rockies howled like a choir of the damned. Rosalie Pendleton sat shivering in the back of a battered stagecoach, her fingers tightly clutching the worn fabric of her wool coat. She was 22, born to a respectable banking family in Philadelphia, but a string of devastating financial ruin had stripped away everything she knew. Her father, desperate and drowning in debt, had sold her hand in marriage to a man she had never met to appease his creditors. She wasn't sent to a wealthy tycoon or a refined gentleman. She was sent to Jasper Hayes. In the frontier town of Silverton, the mere mention of Jasper Hayes made grown men lower their voices. They called him the Grizzly of Widow's Peak. Rumors painted him as a savage, a recluse mountain man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and had killed a band of outlaws with his bare hands. The townsfolk said he lived like an animal, completely detached from civilized society, and now Rosalie was to be his wife. "End of the line, miss," the stagecoach driver, an old man named Hiram, grunted as he pulled the horses to a halt. He didn't bother hiding the pity in his weathered eyes. "I can't take the wagon up the ridge. The snow's too deep. You'll have to walk the rest of the way." Rosalie swallowed the lump of sheer terror in her throat. She stepped out into the knee-deep snow, pulling her single leather trunk from the back. Hiram tipped his hat, looking at her as if she were a ghost already walking to her grave, and quickly spurred his horses back toward the safety of the valley. Left alone in the biting cold, Rosalie began the grueling climb. The altitude burned her lungs, and the biting frost gnawed at her cheeks. She felt entirely inadequate for this brutal world. In Philadelphia, she had been mocked by high society for her figure. She was not the frail, corseted ideal of the time, but possessed soft, generous curves that the cruel matrons called unfashionable. Now, trudging through the snow, she felt her heavy frame was the only thing keeping her from blowing off the mountain entirely. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, bloody streaks of orange across the snow, she saw it. A massive log cabin built directly into the side of the mountain, fortified by thick timber and stone. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in the desolate white wilderness. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She dragged her trunk to the heavy oak door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely knock. Before her knuckles could even graze the wood, the door swung open. Rosalie gasped, stumbling backward into the snow. The man standing in the doorway was a mountain of muscle and shadow. He wore a thick coat of bear hide, and his face was obscured by a thick, dark beard and shaggy hair. A deep, jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, adding to the terrifying mythology she had heard in town. He held a massive wood-splitting axe in one hand, his knuckles white. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the brute to drag her inside, waiting for the violence she had been promised. She braced herself, trembling, fully expecting the beast. But the silence stretched. The wind seemed to die down. Rosalie slowly opened her eyes. Jasper Hayes had dropped his axe. It landed in the snow with a muted thud. His dark, intense eyes were wide, sweeping over her freezing, snow-covered form. But he wasn't looking at her with the contempt or savage hunger she had feared. He looked at her as if she were an angel that had fallen from the sky directly onto his doorstep. His gaze lingered on the soft, full curves of her hips and the heavy rise and fall of her chest beneath her coat, features she had been taught to hate, but which he now viewed with undeniable reverence. He took a slow, heavy step forward. His massive, calloused hand reached out, hovering just an inch from her frozen cheek, radiating heat. "Mine," he whispered gently, his voice a deep, rough gravel that sent a strange, unexpected warmth straight to her core. Before Rosalie could process the tender way he had spoken, the sheer exhaustion and biting cold finally took their toll. Her vision went black, and her legs gave out. She expected to hit the hard, icy ground, but she was caught in a pair of arms as strong as steel, yet as gentle as a cradle. When Rosalie woke, she was not in a cold, filthy hovel, nor was she bound in a savage's den. She opened her eyes to the soft, flickering light of a massive stone hearth. The air smelled richly of burning pine, roasted meat, and clean soap. She was lying on a large bed frame, carved from dark mahogany, wrapped in thick, impossibly soft pelts. She sat up, clutching the furs to her chest. Her wet boots and frozen wool coat had been removed, and she was dressed only in her modest cotton underdress. Panic flared for a brief second, but as she inspected herself, she realized she was completely unharmed. The boots were neatly placed by the fire to dry. "You've been asleep for nearly 2 days," a deep voice rumbled from the corner of the room. Rosalie flinched, pulling the furs tighter. Jasper sat in a heavy rocking chair, whittling a piece of cedar. Without the bulky bear-hide coat, she could see the true breadth of him. He wore a simple flannel shirt that strained against his massive shoulders and thick chest. Up close, despite the intimidating scar, his eyes were a striking, intelligent amber. I brought my papers," Rosalie stammered, her voice raspy. She pointed a trembling finger toward her leather trunk. "The marriage contract. My father sent it." Jasper stopped whittling. He stood up, his sheer size dominating the cabin, and slowly walked over to the stove. He poured a hot cup of broth and brought it to her, keeping a respectful distance. "I don't care about the papers, Rosalie," he said softly, using her name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. "Drink. You were half dead when you arrived." As the days turned into a week, Rosalie's fear began to dissolve into profound confusion. The monster of Widow's Peak was a phantom. The real Jasper Hayes was quiet, meticulous, and gentle. He chopped wood, tracked game, and cooked meals that rivaled any fine dining she had experienced in Philadelphia. Most surprisingly, he treated her like a queen. He slept on a bedroll on the hard wooden floor by the fire, refusing to share the bed until she was comfortable with him. He looked at her curves not with lustful aggression, but with a quiet, burning appreciation that made her cheeks flush. But the mystery remained. Why did a man this capable, this gentle, live completely isolated from the world? And why did the townspeople hate him so much? The truth came to light on a Tuesday evening when a fierce blizzard trapped them inside. Rosalie was looking for an extra blanket in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed when her fingers brushed against a cold metal object. It was a tin-type photograph. In it, a younger Jasper stood beside a beautiful, frail-looking woman. She didn't hear Jasper approach until his massive shadow fell over her. "That was Sarah," he said, his voice hollow, stripped of its usual warmth. "My late wife." Rosalie stood up, her heart aching at the sorrow in his eyes. What happened to her? Jasper moved to the fire, staring into the flames. 4 years ago, I struck a heavy vein of silver on the far side of this ridge. I went down to Silverton to file the claim. The town's magistrate, a man named Cornelius Vance, no, a man named Cornelius Reed, Jasper corrected himself, his jaw clenching, wanted the claim for himself. He sent his men up here to scare Sarah off while I was gone. Jasper's hands curled into massive fists. They got careless, knocked over a lantern. The old cabin burned to the ground with her inside. When I found out, I hunted down the 3 men who did it. I killed them. It's how I got this scar. He touched the jagged line on his face. The law called it frontier justice, but Reed made sure the town saw me as a bloodthirsty animal. He blacklisted me. I built this new cabin, and I've stayed on the mountain ever since, guarding the claim. Rosalie's breath hitched. A cold dread pooled in her stomach as a terrifying realization washed over her. Cornelius Reed. That was the name of the man who had bought her father's debt. That was the man who had arranged this marriage and paid for her stagecoach ticket to Colorado. "Jasper," Rosalie whispered, her hands trembling as she backed toward her leather trunk. She tore open the false bottom of her trunk, ripping through the lining until her fingers found a stiff, wax-sealed envelope. She broke the seal and pulled out the document inside. It wasn't just a marriage contract. It was a transfer of property rights. "He didn't send me here just to be a wife," Rosalie choked out, tears welling in her eyes as she handed the paper to Jasper. Under Colorado territory law, if a man is legally wed, his property becomes joint assets. But if you die, and I am your widow, the claim transfers to my guardian. Jasper's amber eyes scanned the legal document, the muscles in his jaw ticking dangerously. Cornelius Reed hadn't just arranged a marriage, he had arranged an assassination. He had sent a vulnerable society girl up the mountain to be Jasper's bride, knowing full well he planned to send his men up to murder Jasper shortly after. With Jasper dead, Rosalie would be a helpless widow, and Reed, holding her father's debts and acting as her financial guardian, would legally seize the multi-million-dollar silver claim. Before Jasper could speak, the howling wind outside abruptly changed pitch. It wasn't just the wind, it was the frantic, panicked whinny of a horse. Jasper immediately blew out the oil lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness. He moved to the window, pulling back the heavy shutter just a fraction. Through the blinding snow, the silhouettes of 5 men on horseback were visible at the edge of the tree line, carrying rifles and torches. They hadn't waited for the spring thaw. The hunters had arrived. The sudden plunge into darkness left Rosalie blind, her breath catching in her throat as the reality of the situation crashed over her. Outside, the howling wind carried the muffled, menacing sounds of horses stomping through the heavy snowdrifts, and the unmistakable, metallic clack of lever-action rifles being primed. Jasper moved through the pitch-black cabin with the silent, lethal grace of a hunting cat. He was no longer the gentle giant who had carefully poured her broth. He was the grizzly of Widow's Peak, the man the valley whispered about in terrified tones. "Get down," Jasper ordered, his voice a low, commanding rumble that brooked no argument. "Behind the hearth. Now." Rosalie scrambled across the rough-hewn floorboards, her heavy skirts tangling around her legs. She wedged herself into the narrow alcove between the massive stone chimney and the thick oak wall. The heat radiating from the stones was a sharp contrast to the ice-water terror flooding her veins. "Haze!" a voice bellowed from the blizzard outside. It was a cruel, raspy sound that carried over the wind. "We know you're in there. Cornelius Reed sends his regards. Open the door, and we'll make it quick for you. Make us freeze out here, and we'll burn you out just like your first bitch." Rosalie heard a sickeningly sharp intake of breath from Jasper. In the dim, ambient glow of the dying embers, she saw his massive silhouette pause by the reinforced window. "That's Gideon Shaw," Jasper muttered, his voice practically vibrating with raw, unfiltered hatred. "He's a contract killer out of Denver. Reed didn't just send local thugs this time. He paid for the devil himself." Jasper reached up to the mantel, his large hands pulling down a heavy Winchester repeater and a double-barreled shotgun. He moved toward Rosalie, kneeling beside her. Even in the dark, his amber eyes seemed to glow with a fierce, protective light. He pressed the heavy shotgun into her trembling hands. "I don't know how to use this," Rosalie whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Jasper, I've never fired a weapon. I'm a banker's daughter. I'm nobody." Jasper reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping the tear from her frozen skin. His touch was an anchor in the storm. "You are not nobody, Rosalie," he said, his voice surprisingly tender amidst the impending violence. "You are a survivor. And right now, you are the only thing standing between them and what's mine." He guided her fingers to the triggers. "Don't aim. If anyone comes through that door, you point it at their chest and you pull both of these back. The spread will do the rest. Do you understand?" She swallowed hard, looking at the heavy weapon, then up at his scarred face. She thought of the cruel high society women who had mocked her curves, of her father who had sold her like cattle, and of Cornelius Reed who had sent her here to die. Then she looked at Jasper, the so-called beast who had treated her with nothing but absolute reverence. A sudden, burning spark of defiance ignited in her chest. "I understand," she said, her voice steadying. "Good girl," Jasper grunted. He stood up, jacking around into the chamber of his Winchester. "Keep your head down." The silence that followed was agonizing. It stretched for what felt like hours, broken only by the whistling wind. Then the night erupted. A barrage of gunfire shattered the cabin windows. Bullets tore through the heavy wooden shutters, splintering the log walls and sending shards of glass flying like lethal snowflakes. Rosalie screamed, burying her face in her arms as a bullet ricocheted off the stone hearth inches from her head. Jasper returned fire. The deafening roar of his Winchester filled the small space. Each shot a calculated, deadly response. From outside, a man cried out in agony, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the snow. "That's one," Jasper yelled, ducking as a volley of answering fire chewed through the doorframe. "4 left." But Gideon Shaw was a professional, and he knew the terrain. "Spread out," Shaw's voice barked from the darkness. "Keep him pinned. Colt, bring up the kerosene." The word kerosene made Rosalie's blood run cold. She remembered the tintype photograph. She remembered Sarah. Jasper's entire demeanor shifted. The tactical calmness vanished, replaced by a terrifying primal rage. The trauma of his past, the unbearable grief of losing his first wife to the flames, snapped something deep inside him. "No," Jasper roared, a sound so guttural and furious it shook the floorboards. "Not again." Before Rosalie could stop him, Jasper kicked open the heavy oak door. The freezing wind howled into the cabin as he charged straight out into the blizzard, his Winchester firing into the darkness. "Jasper, no!" Rosalie screamed, but he was already gone, swallowed by the swirling white void. The gunfire intensified, a chaotic cacophony of explosions and shouting men. Rosalie remained paralyzed behind the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear the brutal sounds of close-quarters combat, the sickening crunch of bone, a man's wet gurgle, Jasper's furious roars. Suddenly, a heavy boot kicked the remaining shards of glass from the shattered window nearest to Rosalie. A man climbed through, his face wrapped in a filthy red bandana. In his hand, he held a lit torch, the flames licking dangerously close to the dry wooden walls. He didn't see her in the shadows. He raised the torch, preparing to throw it onto the bed. "If you die, the claim transfers to my guardian." The words of the contract echoed in her mind. Rosalie didn't think. The banker's daughter vanished, replaced by a woman fighting for her life and the life of the man who had claimed her. Using her sturdy frame, she lunged upward from the hearth. She didn't fire the shotgun. She knew the recoil might knock her back, and she couldn't risk missing. Instead, she swung the heavy, double-barreled weapon like a club. The solid walnut stalk connected with the side of the intruder's head with a sickening crack. The man crumpled instantly, dropping the torch onto the stone hearth where it sputtered harmlessly. Rosalie stood over him, her chest heaving, the heavy shotgun still gripped tightly in her hands. She felt a surge of raw, terrifying power. She wasn't weak. She wasn't just a pawn. But her victory was short-lived. From outside, the gunfire suddenly ceased. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. "Jasper," she called out, her voice trembling. A shadow appeared in the doorway. It wasn't Jasper. It was Gideon Shaw. He was a lean, hollow-eyed man with a silver-studded holster and a cruel, jagged smile. In his left hand, he dragged Jasper by the collar of his shirt. Jasper was bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his thigh and a deep gash across his forehead, his massive frame struggling to stay conscious. Shaw threw Jasper onto the floorboards with a sneer, leveling a silver-plated Colt revolver directly at Rosalie's chest. "Well now," Shaw drawled, spitting a wad of tobacco onto the floor. "Reed said you were just a fat little society pig waiting for the slaughter, but look at you, standing your ground." Rosalie slowly raised the shotgun, pointing it at Shaw's chest, just as Jasper had instructed. Her hands shook violently, but her eyes were locked onto the killer's. "Drop it, girl," Shaw laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You pull those triggers, the recoil will break both your shoulders. And I'll put a bullet through your pretty little head before the buckshot even reaches me." "Don't, Rosalie." Jasper groaned from the floor, trying to push himself up, his blood pooling on the wood. "Run." "I'm not running," Rosalie said, her voice dropping an octave. She planted her feet firmly, utilizing her low center of gravity and the strength of her full figure to brace herself. Shaw's smile vanished. He cocked the hammer of his revolver. "Suit yourself." Rosalie squeezed both triggers. The explosion in the confined cabin was deafening. A massive flash of fire illuminated the room, blinding them all. The violent kickback of the heavy shotgun slammed into Rosalie's shoulder with the force of a runaway train, throwing her backward off her feet. She hit the floor hard, the wind knocked from her lungs, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Through the stinging smoke and the smell of sulfur, she struggled to open her eyes. Her shoulder throbbed with a blinding agony, and she tasted blood where she had bitten her lip. As the smoke slowly cleared, drawn out by the howling wind through the open door, Rosalie saw the result. Gideon Shaw lay flat on his back, staring blankly up at the timber ceiling. His chest was a ruined, bloody mess. He was dead before he hit the floorboards. The remaining men outside, hearing the thunderous roar of the shotgun and seeing their leader fall, had evidently decided Cornelius Reed's money wasn't worth dying for. The sound of frantic hoofbeats retreating down the mountain signaled their cowardly escape. Rosalie let out a ragged, sobbing breath. She scrambled across the bloody floor, her heavy skirts dragging through the gore, until she reached Jasper. "Jasper! Jasper! Look at me!" she cried, pressing her hands against the wound on his thigh. The blood was warm and flowing fast. Jasper's amber eyes flickered open, hazy with pain. He looked past her to the ruined body of Gideon Shaw, then back to Rosalie. A weak, bloody smile touched his lips. "I told you. Just point and pull. Quiet. Save your strength," Rosalie ordered, tearing the hem of her cotton underdress. She was amazed at her own composure. The crying had stopped. The panic had receded into a cold, focused determination. She tied the fabric tightly around his leg, creating a crude tourniquet to staunch the bleeding. She managed to half-drag, half-carry his massive frame closer to the fire, covering him in the thick bear pelts. For the rest of the night, as the blizzard raged outside, Rosalie kept the fire roaring. She boiled snow for water, cleaned his wounds with whiskey she found in the pantry, and sat by his side, her hand gripping his massive, calloused fingers. By dawn, the storm had finally broken. The morning sun poured through the shattered windows, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the bloody aftermath. Jasper's fever had broken. He opened his eyes, clear and focused, to find Rosalie sitting beside him, her face smudged with soot and blood, her hair a wild tangle. She looked exhausted, battered, and utterly beautiful. "You saved my life," Jasper whispered, his rough voice full of awe. "We saved each other," Rosalie corrected gently, brushing a lock of hair from his scarred forehead. Later that morning, while Jasper rested, Rosalie searched Gideon Shaw's body. Tucked inside his heavy leather duster, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a ledger. It was a meticulous record of Shaw's contracts. And there, written in stark black ink, were the damning entries. Payment received, Cornelius Reed. Target, Sarah Hayes. Job, arson. Payment received, Cornelius Reed. Target, Jasper Hayes. Job, execution. Rosalie's hands shook, not from fear, but from a profound, righteous fury. This ledger was the key. It was the undeniable proof that would clear Jasper's name and send her former guardian to the gallows. 2 weeks later, the spring thaw finally began to melt the heavy snows of Widow's Peak. Jasper, relying heavily on a hand-carved crutch, stood with Rosalie at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the town of Silverton. They had sent the ledger down the mountain with Hiram, the stagecoach driver who had reluctantly checked on them, tasking him to deliver it directly to U.S. Marshal David Neagle, a federal lawman known for his incorruptible nature, bypassing the local corrupt authorities entirely. The response had been swift. From their vantage point, they could see the federal marshals riding into Silverton. Even from a distance, they could see the commotion outside the bank as Cornelius Reed was dragged into the street in irons, his empire of corruption crumbling under the weight of his own hubris. "It's over," Jasper said quietly, his large hand resting on Rosalie's waist. He didn't shy away from her softness. His fingers curled possessively, worshipfully into the curve of her hip. Rosalie leaned her head against his massive chest, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heart. The mountain man, the beast they had warned her about, was the most honorable man she had ever known. And she, the unwanted, heavy-set society girl, was the undisputed queen of this mountain. "Rosalie," Jasper murmured, turning her gently to face him. He looked down at her, his amber eyes burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the hearth fires. He dropped his crutch, ignoring the pain in his leg, and wrapped both of his massive arms around her, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her then, a deep, consuming, and fiercely passionate kiss that tasted of surviving the winter and the promise of spring. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his rough thumb tracing the curve of her jaw, trailing down the soft column of her neck. "Mine," he whispered, exactly as he had on the very first night. But this time, Rosalie smiled, her heart full, her soul completely anchored to the giant of the mountain. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his dark hair, and pulled him back down for another kiss. Always, she answered. Did you love Rosalie and Jasper's rugged frontier romance? If this gripping tale of survival, hidden truths, and finding love in the unforgiving wild captured your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to show your support, share it with your friends who love a true enemies to lovers mountain man story, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, high-stakes romance dramas. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a wild adventure.